Uh, I'll give you a perfect example.
Johnny Carson hosted thousands of guests over 30 years, and most of them showed up sober and professional, ready to promote whatever project or movie they were selling. But some celebrities walked through that curtain clearly under the influence of something, noticeably slurred words, moments where you could see Carson calculating in real time whether he should cut to a commercial early or just ride it out and hope for the best. These are the 9 most high guests that ever appeared on Johnny Carson. Truman Capote. Capote was notorious for appearing on talk shows throughout his career, visibly wasted on something.
Can I ask you some serious questions?
Sure, you can go right in. I feel perfectly fine.
Have you been drinking?
His 1980 appearance is legendary in television history for all the wrong reasons. It's one of those Tonight Show moments people still talk about and reference decades later as a prime example of how spectacularly wrong things can go. He came out completely baked on pills and alcohol, with his words slurred so badly you could barely understand him. At one point, he seemed to completely forget he was on television in front of millions of viewers across the country. Carson's face during this interview is something else entirely if you watch the footage.
I have occasionally had people send me manuscripts that were, or give me manuscripts to read that were absolutely remarkable, and I'll give you a perfect example. Do you know Harper Lee? The girl who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird?
You can see him getting progressively more frustrated and angry in real time, but trying desperately to maintain his professional composure because they're live and millions of people are watching at home. Capote kept losing his train of thought and would start telling a story and then just stop talking midway through. Carson would try to prompt him with questions and follow-ups and get basically nothing useful back. Oliver Reed. Reed's September 1975 appearance with Shelly Winters is one of those Tonight Show disasters people still can't believe actually happened. He came out already heavily intoxicated on what looked like scotch and possibly other things based on how he was acting. He started making offensive comments about women's equality almost immediately with nothing leading up to it. Winters was sitting right there, and you could see her getting angrier by the second.
The women in England are quite good. They're always in the kitchen, so you can't hear them when they shout.
You think that's where they should be?
Then he said something so over the line about women that Winters had apparently had enough.
When you ever go to a hotel and find the chef is a woman, madam?
The audience gave a standing ovation. Carson's face was in absolute shock. Reed just sat there dripping with scotch, looking stunned, like he couldn't believe what just happened. The whole thing felt dangerous and unpredictable in a way Tonight Show segments absolutely shouldn't feel. It became one of those legendary moments that gets retold as an example of how spectacularly wrong things can go when someone shows up drunk and crosses every line imaginable. George Carlin. Carlin came on Carson dozens of times throughout the 70s, and he was almost always stoned, according to what he later admitted in his autobiography.
I find with pot, I'm not a big user anymore, but I have always a joint somewhere near me. Hidden. Might be hidden.
Not falling down high where you can't function or make coherent sentences, but more like a functioning herbalist high where you're just operating on a different frequency than everyone else in the room. He'd sit there in that chair next to Carson's desk with this glazed, relaxed look in his eyes, but still be mentally sharp enough to deliver his bits and keep up with Johnny's questions and banter. The thing is, Carlin later confirmed all of this publicly in his autobiography without any shame. He said outright that he was usually stoned during his Carson spots in that era and just stated it as a simple fact about how he operated back then. You can absolutely see it if you go back and watch the old clips, knowing what to look for and what you're seeing. That specific mellow energy he'd have, that relaxed, almost lazy quality to his movements. The slight delay before responding to questions like the words had to travel just a little bit farther to reach him. The way he'd sometimes zone out for a second mid-conversation and then snap back into focus. But here's the genuinely remarkable thing about it. He never bombed on Carson Carson or got sloppy or embarrassed himself. He just operated at a slightly different speed than everyone else in the room, while still being funny and professional. Carson apparently knew about the situation but didn't care at all because Carlin always delivered good television and got consistent laughs from the audience. The only real consequence was Carson never picked him to guest host the show, despite Carlin being one of the most regular comedy guests. There's something kind of perfect about Carlin being high while discussing authority and rules and society and all the absurd things he railed against in his comedy. Very on brand for him. But it also meant he was literally altered while performing for millions of people, and somehow made it work consistently for years without anyone really calling him out on it publicly. Richard Pryor. Pryor's relationship with hard substances in the 70s is extremely well documented in biographies and interviews and documentaries, and it absolutely showed up visibly in his Carson appearances if you knew what to look for. He'd be brilliant and on absolute fire for 3 minutes delivering comedy gold that nobody else could touch, and then suddenly his focus would just dissolve right in front of your eyes. You'd see it happen in real time on camera. Carson would ask a straightforward, simple question, and Pryor's eyes would drift away to something else, or he'd start on some bizarre tangent that had absolutely nothing to do with anything they'd been discussing. There's a specific 1978 segment that people still point to and analyze where Pryor seems mentally somewhere else entirely. He was laughing at things that aren't jokes and losing his train of thought mid-sentence. It's genuinely uncomfortable to watch because you're seeing someone incredibly talented and brilliant struggling just to stay present in the moment, and Carson's trying his absolute best to steer it and save it. But there's only so much he can do when the guest isn't fully there mentally or emotionally. Then, in 1980 came the horrific freebasing accident where Pryor set himself on fire while using hard substances and nearly died from the severe burns he suffered. That became the unavoidable context for all those earlier appearances that seemed off or concerning. Looking back with that knowledge, you can see the trajectory so clearly. The increasing unpredictability mixed with these concerning absences. It's genuinely sad because Pryor at his best was absolutely untouchable as a comedian, but substances were clearly taking him somewhere else during those Tonight Show visits, and everyone could see it happening in real time, but nobody knew how to stop it or help him. Cheech and Chong. These two were obviously stoned every single time they appeared, and it was literally their entire brand and persona, so nobody pretended otherwise or tried to hide it. They'd come out through that curtain giggling at absolutely nothing in particular, and making jokes that only made sense if you were also on something, and Carson would just lean right into it and embrace it. He'd play the straight man and let them be exactly who they were without trying to fix it or hide it or make it something else. There was something almost refreshingly honest about their appearances without pretending or trying to hide what was completely obvious to everyone watching. The difference with Cheech and Chong compared to all the others on this list is it never felt like a problem or a liability because it was literally the act itself. When George Carlin was stoned, it was something happening behind the comedy. When Cheech and Chong were stoned, it was a comedy. Carson seemed perfectly fine with that clear distinction and let them do their thing exactly as they wanted. It worked because absolutely everyone was in on the joke, including them. Peter Fonda. Fonda's 1970 episode is one of those segments people still debate and argue about online. Staff apparently suspected he'd taken something before coming out through that curtain onto the stage. His pupils were noticeably dilated if you watched the footage closely. He kept fixating on weird random things like the studio lights themselves in his own hands. He started talking about how time isn't linear in this weird, spacey, philosophical way that had absolutely nothing to do with what Carson was asking him about. It wasn't playful or clever detouring either. It felt detached and unfocused, like he was operating on a completely different frequency than the room. Carson tries redirecting him gently at first, but you can see it's not landing. The interview got cut to commercial early, which almost never happened on Carson unless something was seriously wrong and needed to be stopped. When they came back from the break, Fonda had been completely replaced with another guest, and they never addressed it or explained what happened. That's the tell. Carson didn't make awkward jokes about it or acknowledge what everyone watching had just seen happen. He just removed the problem and kept the show going like nothing happened. That quiet reset spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Sammy Davis Jr. There's a 1974 interview where Davis seemed unusually amped up compared to his normal high-energy personality. He was talking incredibly fast and couldn't sit still in the chair. His body language was restless in a way that went beyond nerves or excitement. He kept shifting his posture, leaning forward, then back again, hands constantly moving like his thoughts were racing faster than his mouth could keep up. Even for someone known for intensity, it felt like the dial had been turned just a little too far. Backstage staff apparently whispered about it and speculated, but nothing was ever confirmed on the record. That's important because a lot of Tonight Show lore gets exaggerated over time. No one ever came forward publicly with proof or first-hand accusations. Davis kept it professional enough that the segment aired fine, and nobody watching at home would necessarily notice unless they were looking for it. On the surface, it plays like a hyper guest having a big night. The jokes land. The stories mostly track. Carson keeps the rhythm moving. But if you watch that interview knowing what to look for, there's this frantic, manic energy that feels distinctly off. His speech pattern doesn't breathe the way it normally does. He jumps topics quickly and sometimes interrupts himself mid-thought. The usual polish is still there, but it's strained like he's fighting his own momentum. It's subtle enough that casual viewers wouldn't flag it, but obvious enough that people in the room apparently did. The speculation afterward was hard substances, but that's all it ever was. Rumors, whispers, reading between the lines. Davis was already known for having massive natural energy anyway, so maybe it was just an especially intense night. He worked constantly and thrived on adrenaline. Some performers genuinely live at that speed without chemical help. That's why this moment lives in a gray area, instead of becoming a full-blown scandal. Carson didn't address it during the show or after. He didn't slow things down or make a joke about it or visibly react. That silence actually says a lot. Carson had an incredible instinct for when to call attention to something and when to let it pass. If he felt it was just Davis being Davis, he'd roll with it. If he thought it crossed a line, he'd usually adjust the segment or cut it short. People who worked there that night apparently all knew something was different. Not dangerous, not out of control, just different enough to stand out to professionals who'd seen thousands of guests pass through those chairs. That's why the interview still gets talked about decades later. Not because anything exploded, but because it didn't. It sits in that uneasy space where nothing is provable, but something feels off, and the room remembers it, even if the tape never confirms it. George Gobel. Gobel's 1969 appearance is famous for the lonesome polecat line that became legendary, but also for the plastic cup he's holding when he comes out through the curtain. He'd apparently been sitting in the green room drinking for a good while before his segment was up. He came out clearly tipsy with that relaxed, overly confident energy that comes specifically from alcohol loosening you up. Not sloppy or falling apart, but softened around the edges in a way that's impossible to miss if you know what you're looking for. His timing is just a beat slower than usual. His focus drifts slightly between jokes. There's a looseness in his posture and delivery that feels casual rather than controlled. What makes the appearance fascinating instead of disastrous is that Gobel still knew exactly who he was and what worked. He leaned into self-awareness instead of fighting the moment. The lonesome polecat joke lands because it's rooted in insecurity and humility, which makes the audience instantly side with him. He wasn't trying to dominate the room or prove anything. He was playing small on purpose, which made the laughs feel warmer and more genuine. The alcohol didn't derail the act, but it did blur the precision just enough that the performance felt raw instead of polished. Carson clearly clocks what's going on immediately. You can see it in Johnny's face. There's no tension or concern, just mild amusement and curiosity. He lets Gobel ramble a little longer than usual and doesn't interrupt or tighten the reins. That choice matters. A different host might have panicked or tried to steer harder. Carson trusted Gobel to land it, and he did. That's why this appearance lives in Tonight Show lore. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt human, a little messy, a little loose, and still funny enough to work. The cup, the line, the vibe, it all fused into something people remembered for decades. Sam Kinison. Kinison's show episodes in the late 80s coincided with his widely reported and publicly acknowledged struggles with hard substances. Fans who watched those appearances often describe some of those spots as him being clearly on something beyond just his natural manic energy. That's what makes them uncomfortable in hindsight. Kinison was always loud and aggressive and explosive by design. That was his act. But there's a difference between controlled chaos and genuine instability, and sometimes you can feel that line getting crossed. In certain appearances, his eyes look unfocused. His pacing feels erratic instead of intentional. The screaming doesn't build to punchlines the way it normally does. It just erupts. Some jokes feel rushed while others spiral out without direction. You can sense Carson watching him closely, not laughing freely but monitoring the situation. Johnny lets him go, but not too far. The segments are noticeably shorter and tighter than usual, which is never accidental on Carson's show. Carson was famously protective of his stage and his audience. He knew when something was off. With Kinison, you can feel while him allowing just enough rope without letting things unravel completely. That balance is why those clips feel strange now. They aren't bombs, but they aren't clean victories either. They sit in that gray area where talent is still present, but the machinery underneath is unstable. Watching those appearances now isn't about laughing as much as witnessing a moment in time. You're watching a comedian at the height of fame, but clearly wrestling with something darker off camera. The laughs still come, but they're uneven and nervous. The energy feels volatile instead of electric. That's what changes the tone entirely when you revisit them knowing the context. It stops being pure comedy and becomes a document of someone burning too hot too fast right in front of a national audience. The 70s and 80s were a completely different era for substances in the entertainment industry. The pressure was absolutely massive and relentless. A lot of performers turned to substances just to cope with it all or keep up the manic energy that the industry demanded from them. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does help explain why so many of Carson's guests showed up in questionable condition. There were fewer guardrails and far less public accountability, and the culture often rewarded excess instead of punishing it. Being wild was sometimes mistaken for being interesting or authentic. Carson himself had to navigate all of this as a host and decide when to let it slide and when to pull the plug. He walked a constant tightrope between protecting the show, protecting the audience, and not publicly humiliating guests who were clearly struggling in real time. Which of these guests shocked you the most when you first saw them? Did you notice these moments when you watched them live? Or did you just realize it looking back with more knowledge and context learned from this deep dive? Tell us and everyone else what you think in the comments section down below. And if you want more deep educational dives into the wild, uncomfortable, forgotten side of Tonight Show history, support the channel by clicking both the like button and the subscribe button after this video to help us keep creating content just like this.